Mechanical creativity in games can be a great thing. New trends, the best classics, the most addicting experiences almost always stem from when a game tries to do something new within its genre, if not also pushing toward a new genre entirely. But unfortunately, it's not always a success. Unfortunately, sometimes simplicity ends up with so much more of a polished experience, if only because it's balanced and easy to understand. Unfortunately, today it looks like that's the case. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is praised as one of the best indie horror titles that has ever existed. That's saying a lot since the genre has exploded on the indie scene in the last few years. The sequel, A Machine for Pigs, doesn't reach the same levels of acclaim, with critics complaining that it feels empty without all of the survival-oriented mechanics from the original. While I understand where these opinions are coming from, I can't help but disagree. That's not what I was expecting, mind you. But in this case, I think the mechanics of Dark Descent end up getting in the way of its success. Great ideas, but the execution leaves too much to be desired for me. If anything, it feels like people praised Dark Descent for what it could have been, and criticized Machine for Pigs for not trying to carry the torch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind a bit and elaborate. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a first-person survival horror game. It's set in an alternate version of our world, where hidden deep within human history sleeps a handful of strange orbs, capable of warping the minds of those near them, capable of sending a shadowy evil after them, and anyone they make contact with, until everyone is dead. Dark Descent puts a lot of effort into its plot, and I think it works well enough. It's probably nothing I'll remember for terribly long, and it's really simple, but I think it works as a nice motivation for the player to continue. It's written competently for such a small project, and it's paced nicely. Voice acting can be a bit goofy and hammy, but it's also fun because of that. Mechanically, Dark Descent has a few big creative ideas that it tries to offer. On paper, these ideas are fantastic. This is probably the game you could attribute to the modern powerless fantasy when it comes to horror games. Outlast gives you objects to hide in and around. Five Nights gives you doors to close and lights to shine. Dark Descent gives you a lantern, and limited fuel for both it and other light sources around the game. None of these games offer the player any truly offensive maneuvers of note. You're powerless against the monsters out to get you. Your best bet is to just stay out of their way. Your lantern is fueled by oil, and you can also find little boxes of tinder that will light a single candle, torch, sconce, or whatever else. While I found tinder boxes to be common enough that I never ran low unless I chose to use them with reckless abandon, oil is going to be rare for basically everyone who tries this game. And you'll need all that you can get, because staying in the dark or witnessing supernatural events and the existence of monsters will lower your sanity level. The less sane you are, the more creepy things will begin to show up. But more importantly, your vision begins to blur and warp, and your controls eventually become super sluggish, making escape and exploration much more difficult. The main goal of Dark Descent is to explore further and further into the manor you find yourself in, avoiding monstrosities and learning about the past you seem to have forgotten. This game is all about contradictions and choices mechanically, and this is its intention. Sometimes it works, and a lot of the time it doesn't. Like, for example, the idea of losing sanity when you look at monsters is great for building tension. Look at the monster, and you're going to have to deal with wonky vision and controls if it sees you and begins chase. You can avoid that fate by not looking, but then how will you know if your position has been compromised? This does a great job of giving players a feeling of instant helplessness. You feel frozen in indecision, which is good. It's the other mechanics that, in practice, begin to fall over. The big problem with this game? Light is good and dark is bad, but light is bad and dark is good. So, as I said, light slowly raises your sanity levels and darkness quickly lowers them. So you want to stay in the light as much as possible, right? Well, not really, because you're also guaranteed to be caught if you hang out in light all the time. The game tries to push you toward using oil over tinder, because if you light up a room with tinder and then a monster comes in, there's nowhere for you to hide. But if you use your lantern instead, all you have to do is turn it off and you're enshrouded in darkness. This all sounds fine and good as it is, but it's the balance that ends up hurting the game. As I've said, oil is rare. Oil is your lifeblood, because without it you can't see anything in most areas. That means exploring, heading off enemies, not running into things. It all becomes frustratingly difficult when you don't have your lantern on. You don't actually die when you run out of sanity. The game just turns into a drunk simulator. So what ends up happening is one of two things. One, you either run out of oil while trying to explore, and then you're stuck feeling around in the dark for that darned puzzle item you need to continue. Or two, you try your hardest to conserve your oil, meaning most of the time you're stuck feeling around in the dark for that darned puzzle item you need to continue. Do you see the issue here? This game is designed so that your punishment for not having light is total darkness in most cases, as well as awful controls. And again, tinder isn't the best idea because it limits your hiding spaces the more you use it. But without light, the core of the game, exploration, becomes a painful chore. But it gets even worse when you realize that punishments for being killed are almost non-existent. Respawns are strange. They're kind of like checkpoints, kind of like Bioshock Vita chambers. You usually respawn nearby, often even past the monster or where you were headed. If you had low health before you died, it'll be mostly refilled. So what ends up happening when you run out of patience with the incessant darkness in an area? You start just sprinting around, lighting everything up, getting ganked by monsters, and then respawning safe and sound. All tension is gone at that point. The game then turns into an awkward scavenger hunt, where the only rooms that are engaging are the ones where monsters don't appear. And let's be real, this does account for most areas. Monsters are pretty rare in this game, but still, if they can't make an area scary because mechanically the game is unbalanced, then it's hard to even call this a horror game, so much as a light puzzle game in a dark castle. If I'm completely honest, and it's not just because of the similar aesthetic, Dark Descent in most areas is about as scary as Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. No, seriously. Oblivion was a game that gave me a bit of tension when I first played it, because I didn't know what the game was capable of mechanically. But once I learned what it had to offer, once I learned how powerful the player is and how dumb the AI is, it was about as tense and scary as playing a Mario game. I felt the same way about Dark Descent. There are other little things that bothered me as well. For example, the death hints can be far too upfront. People are going to keep these hints on because it's not clear what they even are when you just start the game, and they default to on. Then, most likely, if you don't die before this, you'll enter the hallway with the invisible water monster, die before you can even assess the situation, and the game will proceed to outright tell you to stay out of the water to survive. They should have turned this option off by default if it's going to give you that big of a hint. Speaking of said water monster, it has the same problem as everything else. The second you touch the water, he knows where you are, as well as where you'll end up. He then proceeds to hover around you for eternity, so your choice is to wait forever until he begins to leave, or just say screw it and leap haphazardly across the string of boxes. Again, it destroys all of the tension in an otherwise interesting idea. The expansion for Dark Descent, titled Justine, is better in theory, but I had a really bad first experience with it, and therefore I didn't finish it. This DLC is a short side story that's set in a series of puzzle rooms. Solve the puzzle and the prisoner in a nearby torture chamber survives. Don't solve it and you still get to move on, but they die. As far as I played, neither the oil in the lantern or the tinder lighting stuff seems to come into play in the same way as the main game, instead being used purely for puzzles. Sanity also has no effect here, and there is no saving. Great concept overall. Here's what happened to me when I first played it. My first try saw me running around the first puzzle room for quite a while. The game hadn't used physics much for puzzles before, so it took me a while to get desperate enough to start stacking junk to reach objectives. Stacking these objects can be a pain, if you don't remember that you can use the D-pad to rotate objects. And why would you remember that from the beginning of the base game? It's never used in the base game. Regardless, I stacked things, found what I needed to find, and moved on. But since the game said I was supposed to save these people, I assumed that I had failed. The guy was still locked up in the cell and strapped to the torture device. So I started over, and then experimented with the lever next to his cell. I'd messed with it before and it lowered the spike toward him, so I assumed that that was the easy fail button. This time I kept messing with it, and it did indeed kill him, before dropping the ladder in the place I'd escaped from last time, allowing me to continue. It was then that I understood that I'd done it correctly the first time. The goal was to keep him alive, not to help him escape, like I had been led to believe. So I restarted again, watching the unskippable cutscene at the beginning for the third time. As I began moving, I realized that I could only turn about 270 degrees for some reason. Regardless of which direction I rotated in, I would always be stopped about 3/4 of the way around. So I exited again, watched the cutscene again, and the problem persisted. So I closed the game, reopened it, and tried again. The problem was finally fixed, so I continued on. I stacked the junk, exited the first area, and started the second puzzle. This one was a bit confusing for me, because I didn't know whether it wanted me to follow Justine's lead, or do the opposite of her. That, and I accidentally started the torture device twice before I realized I was killing the guy. My bad. I failed, of course, but the way opened up regardless. I decided just to continue. On the way to the third area, there was an enemy in a dark room that was full of junk and seemed to be full of connecting rooms. It was hard to see and I had no oil, so I clumsily hugged the wall. Suddenly, I hear the telltale signs of a monster seeing me. Deciding to accept my fate, I let him hit me. I was a bit surprised when he killed me in one hit, despite having full health. I was a lot more surprised when I was kicked back to the main menu. I knew the mode didn't allow you to save, but I at least assumed that you were checkpointed at the end of each puzzle as long as you kept playing. Apparently not, so if I wanted to continue, I'd have to watch the cutscene for a 7th time, and frustratingly stack junk for a 3rd time. I stopped there. If your DLC is all about mind games and puzzles, why would you put one-hit kill enemies in dark rooms between the puzzles? It doesn't feel like the punishment was warranted or fair. Either include enemies but also include checkpoints, or don't include checkpoints but don't include enemies. If the DLC was all about enemy avoidance, then having no checkpoints makes sense. It would make it feel almost like a roguelike enemy gauntlet. But it just doesn't work when my punishment for failing something other than the puzzles is to repeat the exact same puzzles in the same exact ways over and over again until I succeed, and hope I don't get hit by a monster in the meantime. Okay, so on to A Machine for Pigs. I won't pretend that I wasn't initially worried about this game. Development of this game shifted to the team The Chinese Room, whose other official projects consist of Dear Esther and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. The Chinese Room is infamous for creating much more passive experiences, which lack much in terms of mechanical diversity or depth, which is not to say that their games are bad or good or whatever, just that they usually focus more on the visuals, the audio, and the narrative of a game to sell their experiences. Gameplay as we traditionally see it usually isn't involved much. That's not what I wanted from Machine for Pigs after playing Dark Descent. But at the same time, I also knew it was likely to have a much more solid presentation than its predecessor. My concerns with the gameplay were partially correct, but luckily not to the degree that I'd feared. And my hopes for the presentation were completely correct. A Machine for Pigs is a significantly more beautiful and diverse game when it comes to visuals and level design. Dark Descent feels much more like a somewhat cobbled together set of environments. Most of them look a little too similar, and a lot of the identity of an environment comes from the objects set within them. What identifies the machine room is the pipes and the gears, but otherwise it's still a series of squares made of wood and brick. It feels old, but not time-specific in any way that solidifies the environments. They have very little personality a lot of the time, though there are a few areas that look interesting and diverse, like this weird giant chamber that has almost Morrowind-esque design in it, and red fog everywhere. That's kind of interesting. It's still a big empty open space, but it's interesting. Machine for Pigs, likewise, has a very strong identity. It feels like it's late 19th century London, regardless of its actual accuracy. The pacing of environments works well too, moving from a high-end mansion to the streets of London, to a giant cathedral, to factories, to laboratories, etc. Transitions from each environment to the next feel natural and make a little more sense than in the previous game. It never feels like just another door to just another random new area. It feels like it makes sense that you're going where you're going, from where you're coming from, if that makes any sense. But beyond that, each of the individual environments are much more distinct, both in how you traverse them and in how they're visually represented. The environments themselves feel different, rather than just the objects placed within them feeling different. Mechanically, Machine for Pigs does do what I expected to some degree. The Chinese room decided to remove the survival mechanics that didn't work well in the original. The lantern now has infinite power, and instead flickers when an enemy approaches, warning you to turn it off. Tinder doesn't exist, because electricity powers many of the lights, which can be freely turned on and off. There's no sanity meter to worry about either, and not even an inventory to speak of. Puzzles are more individualized between sections, and are usually more focused on simple mental challenges rather than finding objects to put in holes and such. Which is not to say that they're better than the puzzles in Dark Descent. Both approaches have their ups and downs, and I think a combination of both would be the best choice. Unfortunately, that's about all there is to Machine for Pigs. It's a really simple, slightly more linear experience. With few mechanics to speak of, well, there's few mechanics to speak of. On the one hand, I think the simplification of the game is a bit sad. Instead of working to fix the quirks introduced in Dark Descent's mechanical ideas, Machine for Pigs removes them entirely. Those mechanics didn't even get a chance to be fixed, and their potential is therefore lost. On the other hand, there is something to be said for making a game that functions first and innovates second. Machine for Pigs is undoubtedly a much more polished, functional product. It feels complete and never once frustrated me along the way. Dark Descent didn't accomplish that. Every time I got to the end of a play session with Dark Descent, I was content to let it end, because I was kind of bored of the mechanical shortcomings taking out any of the tension the experience was offering. When I got to the end of a Machine for Pigs play session, I was likewise content to let it end because I was reaching my limits for how much tension I could handle in a single sitting. In other words, I wanted to stop playing Dark Descent after a few hours because it couldn't scare me. I was too focused on the tedium. But I wanted to stop playing Machine for Pigs after a few hours because it would become too tense. I wouldn't say that Machine for Pigs ever outright scared me. Though, to be completely fair, very few games can do that. Exploring in Machine was intense for sure, but as soon as I was caught by an enemy, the tension did immediately die, and it always struggled to come back after that until I was in a new area. But still, tension was much more common overall, because I could focus on the game, rather than a bunch of what are essentially stamina meters that are slowly draining. If any one of these stamina meters dropped to critical levels in Dark Descent, the experience became a slog, because the punishment of utter darkness and/or awful controls didn't gel well with the exploration goals of the game. Machine for Pigs doesn't have this problem at all, and therefore didn't let my mind wander away from the immediate goals, and immediate dangers. In the end, I can't say that I truly loved any of these games that much. I do value mechanical-driven horror much more than that which relies primarily on presentation. Really great survival mechanics can take a good horror presentation and push it way over the edge. There's a reason I struggled to play games like Resident Evil 1 for more than an hour at a time, until I'd gone through the game enough to become comfortable with it, and it's because the mechanics worked with the presentation. A Machine for Pigs doesn't have any of the mechanical tension, despite the really nice presentation, and unfortunately, Dark Descent tries to have said mechanical tension, but can't keep the mechanics themselves from detracting from the experience. I would say that I still like Machine for Pigs a little bit more, and if I had the choice, that's probably the one that I would go through again. Regardless, for small, independent titles, I'd still say these are impressive feats. I don't want to take away from what was built here, and I think both of these developers can do something great in the future. Maybe they already have, I'm not sure. But as far as playing either of these games, I can't say I was super impressed either. If you're curious and really interested in unique gameplay ideas, Dark Descent will give you something to ponder. And if you want simple, somewhat on rails but consistent horror, Machine for Pigs will at very least keep you interested. But what do you guys think? Have you played either game? Have you actually completed Justine? What's the scariest game you've ever played, and why? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.